Hey folks, this is our 20th episode of Dungeon Master Diaries, and we wanted to take a moment at the top of the show to thank you for listening. The show was born from two things. First, a desire to be a constructive part of the growing Shadowdark community, and second, to offer valuable reflections that are worth your time, worth the listener's time.
We hope you've enjoyed the show and our ramblings thus far. And if you have, we mean it at the end of the show when we say we would love to hear from you. We aren't particularly interested in advertising or seeking out new listeners. And while we are flattered, we also aren't trying to parlay the show into a sponsorship for free RPG stuff. Thank you to those who have offered. Honestly, we're just two guys who run a lot of games of Shadowdark and just love games in general. As such, wanted to thank those of you, especially our early adopters, which is anybody who's listening to this right now, who found the show and continue to listen. But we also do really want to hear from you.
We want the show, as much as possible, to be a catalyst for conversation. And it has been that in many cases. But we want to hear from more folks who are tuning in, and we want to hear about your experience at the table, your experience. So if something in an episode is relevant to you and your time at the table with your group or groups, chime in on the Facebook page or the Discord. All right. With that, we bring you the 20th ever episode of Dungeon Master Diaries. Okay, cool.
Feels like there should have been some spooky music to cue this one.
Oh, yeah. I thought about doing that, and I was like,
yeah, it took us 6 fucking hours. No, it didn't. But
yeah.
What music are we going to use?
Well, we got to the correct music, so here we go. You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about the recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss Vampire the Masquerade. Hello there, blood drinkers and daywalkers. My name's Jody, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague and experiencer of new things, including drinking blood. Matt, how you doing?
Oh, my God. I have no quick comeback. That was a lovely improvisational moment on your part. Excellent work.
Yeah, thanks. That was something we did. Today's episode, if you couldn't figure it out, is going to focus on Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness. Matt, take us to the table.
All right, Jody. So I ran recently my very first session of Vampire, which is a significant departure from Shadowdark in a multitudinous number of ways. And the cool part about this session was that I ran it for you, your wife, and your daughter. And we'll kind of get back to, and I want to kind of follow up on some of the interesting and complex nature of running and playing in a game with family members. But what I really want to talk about here that made this session really interesting and something that I wanted to talk about on the show was that we started with blank character sheets. There was literally nothing on your character sheets when we started. And as Vampire is wont to do, we played in the modern era in our town that we live in. And all that together, combined with the lore of Vampire and the kind of ethos of the game, which, you know, Vampire has a reputation of being a bit of the edgelord kind of a vibe, Jody. I think we eschewed a lot of the parts of Vampire that maybe people would pejoratively or otherwise kind of negatively talk about. And I think we really leaned into some of the really cool parts of what a game that labels the GM the storyteller and certainly is much more linear and plot focused in terms of session planning from my perspective than Shadowed Ark, the game that we are eventually going to bring this conversation back to.
All right, well, let us gather around the fire, because we certainly can't go out into the sunshine and talk about this.
You're just going to lean into this the
I
whole
am
episode.
leaning hard, dude. Let's talk about some Vampire and World of Darkness. And right off the top, you alluded to it in the intro. I'm just going to railroad this darn conversation for a moment. This was incredibly special for me because, as dumb as it sounds, and I don't care who's at me, Vampire the Masquerade played a significant role in meeting my wife and possibly, dare I say, wooing her. It has been a game I had never played until this session, and had always wanted to. Long story short, she was in a group of vampire and RPG gamers with my roommate back in the day. And she wandered into my door one evening, and the rest is kind of history, but had always been curious about playing Vampire. So right off the top, getting to sit and play with her was super cool and kind of closed the loop on a 20-year something there, which was fun. And she can confirm right off the top, was thrilled to get back into it. But that's enough of my personal life story to kick us off.
That is something I didn't really fully grasp when I pitched this, and it's worth noting that we weren't necessarily just going to run a session with you, your daughter, and your wife. We had another player who had to back out because they got sick. Really at the last minute. I mean, I think literally while you guys were in the car on your way over to my
he was
house.
Trying desperately to make it happen, and there's no. The plague needs to stay with you, buddy.
Let's bring it maybe a little bit sort of more broad here. I don't know that everyone is going to be able to identify with
that piece of the nostalgia of playing it, much less with our own blood spawn being the kid, who is, for reference to those who are listening, if you are worried, is in her mid-20s. She is, we say
Yes.
the kid and daughter, Matt's known her since she was in middle school, and, not new.
No.
An adult in her own right in many ways. So it was not weird to be vampires drinking blood. You know what? Let's dive in on the yucky stuff first. Let's get that out of the way.
Sure.
The World of Darkness games, and Vampire being the poster child of the World of Darkness set of games, does have some bad press. Stu Horvath's of Vintage RPG podcast book Monster, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground does a great job if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of this. Not only does the game capture a certain zeitgeist of its time in the 90s, but there's some gross stuff. How did you grapple with that, or find the 5th edition now, are they in, of the World of Darkness game? How did you see it there? What were your thoughts on that? Because it is something that you and I try and be mindful about, being careful as two white dudes to how we approach gaming. This game's fraught with problems at times, or at least historically.
Okay, so a couple things, just to get a couple things out of the way very quickly. First of all, like I'm a government and politics and history teacher. You teach English and now kind of more broadly than just English, but that's where you cut your teeth. Yeah. So there are lenses through which we read RPG products that are we can't escape, right? And there are ways that we run that we can't escape. So that might be why you enjoy, right, more kind of linear focused storytelling, because it provides an arc. And I tend to like faction play because it provides politics and kind of the grandeur of, realpolitik and economic and social kind of stuff. So
the logic holds.
Right. Okay. So all that out of the way, and just kind of as a preface, the thing that I immediately latched onto when I was reading the 5th edition of Vampire, and I had done some research. Surprising, Jody. That I did some research. I did some light research to kind of figure out, okay, I know that there's a vibe here. I know that there's kind of like some people have some pretty strong feelings about the arc of the history of Vampire. So I kind of try to figure out, like, okay, where did things kind of get off the rails? And it does seem that there is, in Vampire, a bit of a fraught problem because it is based on blood and bloodlines, which historically in the real world has led to some pretty gross historical events. And I don't want to delve too deeply into the politics or history of this, but like it's not too far of a jump to get from the strength of your bloodline to some pretty gross stuff. That said, the 5th edition of the game really does seem to be doing a good job of eschewing those things and really trying to bring it back to the central question of Vampire that I really want to grapple at, which is the humanity of the person. This is a game that is it's antithetical to the way that we think about Shatterock in so many ways because it is intensely about the narrative of your character. And I mean, just functionally, your character is, for all intents and purposes, basically immortal. And there are very few ways that you can actually permanently die in Vampire. And so there's this expectation, even more so than the kind of pejoratives that we throw around about 5th edition, that it's, that it's these invincible characters and whatever, and they're going to live forever, and people write these long backstories. In Vampire, the game is about your character. And so the other component of that, I think, is that you can get some solipsistic, very me-focused, maybe main character syndrome. And I don't know. I kind of want to throw this back to you. Those are the two things that immediately sprung out to me. This fraught enterprise of talking about bloodlines and the kind of social and political complications therein. And then this problem of when you create a game that's exclusively about characters, you got players who are inevitably going to really want to get into character. And that's got to be the vibe at the table, right?
It does. And yet, you're going to create a character and you have to tell the story. I mean, it's mechanically a core to the game of the hunger mechanic, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Your as a vampire, desire to consume, drink blood, and drain people, and depending on your meter, feeling bad about that as a human, or really embracing your now found immortality and superiority, and they're cattle and they're there for the taking. And your table group will have to have those discussions. There is also, to play into Matt's bandwidth pretty exclusively, but it's also the thing that I can say my wife really loves. One of the things she loves about Vampire. She herself is pretty goth in her aesthetic and just general worldview. Sure. She would be able to explain it much better than I am. So I'm going to pull up before I indict myself. But there are factions. Long story short, there are factions that represent different ways of addressing, embracing the prospect of, frankly, immortality and having, air quotes, superpowers. And that part of the game is necessary, frankly. I think that to counterbalance my story and the ennui of eternal life.
Dude, great. I mean, to be able to use ennui correctly in a sentence on a podcast is like a bucket list item.
Yeah, tell your students to add that to the list. But the counterbalance is a world of politics, and politics within and I don't even know if they use this term anymore. It used to be the vampire clans.
I don't know how much and we can get into as much lore as you like. Two things. First of all, I don't want to get too far deep into like the nomenclature, because this is one of those games that has a lot of proper nouns for the names of the clans, and the names of various mechanics actually have the hunger dice, right? Like it is certainly a game that is attempting to create a vibe and aesthetic, and it does so very successfully. But what you're saying about the factions is so important, because you're right. Like the game, and I'll also say, like we were preparing to have a live action role play session for your wife's birthday, who is super excited about this. And I just need to get these damned players to the table. It's I don't understand how family and holidays can be more important than playing role-playing games, Jody.
Scheduling the big bad of every campaign, even when it's just about you.
I kid, but we do need to have a couple more of these sessions, and I want to get into what the session actually looked like. But for the purposes of this discussion here, kind of big broad strokes, the factions are super important. There's also, and this might be kind of a nice segue, there's also a significant difference from Shadowdark in that this is a skill-based game, not a class-based game. Like, you get a clan, and that is in some ways reminiscent of a class, but it just gives you some additional kind of powers and abilities. And we didn't even use clans in this, or their clan abilities in this session at all. You guys got your clans at the end of the session. And so what this session was an introduction both for the players and their characters to the world of darkness. And I actually want to spend a considerable amount of time here, Jody, because this is where I think we can actually take some stuff from this session and apply it to our Shadowdark games, or at least talk a little bit about why running different games is a good thing. So to kind of set the scene, and I want to let you talk about what your experience was as a player. I had you guys start with blank character sheets. I think I had you write a name and maybe something else on your character sheets. It has been a little longer than I would have liked between the session and our recording of it, but that's the way things go. But here's the rub, is you had no skills, no stats or kind of core abilities.
No dots.
No dots.
Dots are important.
And this game uses a D10 dice pool mechanic where, depending on the number of dots that you have in your attribute or your stat plus a skill, you roll that number of D10s. You're trying to hit 6s or above. And there's some rules for criticals that we don't really need to get into. But long story short, you're trying to get a number of successes. And from my perspective, starting you with blank character sheets and starting you basically just in the moments where you woke up from having been turned into a vampire was, I don't know of any other session that I have started and felt less confident that it was going to go well. I have never, maybe not since I ran my first role-playing session, have I ever felt less sure of the outcome of a game. And I just, when you walked in and I told you kind of the premise and like, what was your thought when I was like, we're just going to start with a blank character sheet?
Yeah, it was great, but I'll say it was great because I have run, and this is a weird call out and whatever, I've run the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons module Treasure Hunt, N4, for those keeping score of your old school modules at home. N4, Treasure Hunt, it's a D&D game that begins this way. You have your stats and a name and go. And that's it. Like, no class, no abilities, no nothing. So I really enjoyed that. Long story short, when I ran that session, I thought it was fantastic, really enjoyed it. The players enjoyed it. It turned out great. So I had that safety net of as a player, having already GM'd that style of game, was like,
did you run that in 5th edition?
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
I ported it over using the 5e rules. So yeah, you had none of your super abilities at all. Yeah,
wow.
You're a level 0 nothing burger with a name and a hope I get to be this class. So I wasn't too worried about it. And actually, I'm a little surprised to hear that you were that nervous about it. You hit it very well, sir. What I was curious about was, as somebody who didn't know how the system was going to work, I had heard my wife speak of dots before, and I knew that there were D10s, and she was very excited to show me both way back in the day, and then finding them again, the bespoke 90s vampire set of D10s.
So I will say that a non-trivial amount of my my feeling of a little bit of exposure or being worried or apprehensive, a non-trivial amount was the fact that your wife was at the table, and I knew this was like a thing that she was looking forward to, and I didn't want to disappoint, right? And I didn't want it to be, I wanted to be a new experience because I know that she hadn't really played this kind of a game, like the start to a larger narrative before. But I also was like, man, here is this person who knows more about the world than me. And this is an interesting problem to have as a GM, is when somebody knows more about the world than you do. Again, more topics to talk about than we have time, but that's kind of why I was feeling like that.
Sure. And valid. And I think anybody would be a little nervous about, oh man, one of the players here knows exactly what they're in for, and I have no idea where we're headed. So you did the smart thing, though. You made the right call. Of our opening scene was we awoke feeling terrible in a meat locker with a locked door and some cameras we found very quickly. And we're asked questions about how would you react to that moment of you are sitting in a meat locker with hanging slabs, pork and beef. I think it was just beef, actually. At least it was in my head. And what do you do? And what do you do? And then you did a nice job of incorporating little bits of the supernatural as it was, as you're looking around, you noticed the smell of, and there was a body of a human hanging in the center. Actually, I'd forgotten that till for a moment. And our reactions to that and feeling this compulsion to interact with this body and like, well, are you going to just deny that? Or are you going to lean into it? Which also I thought was really smart is you immediately broke down to a binary of, are you going to do this or that? Now
Right.
that I'm remembering the first question really was, you set the scene and went, there's this body, this human hanging in the center of this room. How do you react to that? Do you feed and go to it, or do you shy away from it? And it was a binary. And that's kind of like, you for years have had students kind of ask you like, hey, what's this D&D thing? What's this RPG thing? And you always take them to a similar, I don't know if you still do it, but you used to always take them to a similar scene of, you've been walking through the woods and blah, 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 and you have your this and that, and then you come to a river and it's a rushing river and you need to get across. What do you do?
Yeah. And
you're off. And just like that, you're off and you're playing.
So two things about this opening scene. First of all, what is interesting about Vampire is that it has mechanics that literally compel the players to, I don't want to say like it forces you to feel something, but what I immediately realized was that because Vampire is a different game, as a storyteller or as the GM, right, I actually had to tell you that your characters were feeling something, which is a very strange thing that I am wildly uncomfortable with. But it is literally baked into the game, and if you don't say it audibly, or I guess if you don't say it so like clearly is what I mean, so the players internalize it very quickly, then the whole core premise of the game is lost. And so we were playing through the scenario loosely. I changed a bunch of stuff. And immediately, basically, you guys went completely off the rails because you're players and you're wonderful. So, to get back to my point, I think the thing that was really interesting to me was that in that opening scene where I told you see this body and you feel compelled to go to it. Do you basically give in to that feeling? I don't know how I feel about that in general, because in role-playing games, the GM telling you how you feel is a very slippery slope. But I did, in this context, because it's core to the game, it felt like the kind of push that you all needed to really get into that frame of mind. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Because I felt really uncomfortable, but the table reaction, there was no pushback. There was a, that's sort of the core conceit of the game. So I don't know. I don't have a particularly good question other than your thoughts.
Yeah. I don't have the same taboo you do around this one. And it's a good taboo. It's a good barometer. Your statement that it's a slippery slope to start telling characters what they feel is 100% correct. I don't think there's much room for debate there.
Sure.
You are afraid lest there is some kind of fear mechanic at play of, no, this thing is supernaturally horror filling and you're going back off. That said, I'm pretty comfortable with it. It's about providing context to make meaningful choices. And if you're sitting down to play a game of Vampire, the notion that your vampire would want to feed needs addressing. That said, having the GM go, you feel a compulsion to feed. In fact, you have an increasing compulsion to feed. This is how you function, whether you know it or not. Do you give in? Do you give in? It begs the core conceit of the game. And I can see plenty of instances in other role-playing games where you would do the same thing. You are standing before the king. There is an expectation of pomp and circumstance. There's an expectation of conduct in this setting. Your character has social stakes and is feeling that. I'm not telling you what to feel, but I am telling you that you would have some sort of feeling about this. You would be aware. I don't see that as inappropriate in any way. There's a difference between setting a stage for this is the feelings you're needing to process versus telling them you're intimidated by the king.
That's interesting.
Shades
point
of gray.
taken. Point taken. I think the part that I get a little, I don't know, I just get scared of is, well, funny use of the word scared is when you like tell a character that they are scared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's when it feels
right.
It's like, you don't need to tell a character you're scared. You're the GM. Just scare the crap out of them, describe the scene in a way that scares them. But I kind of want to move from that scene to something else, which is we set this in the modern era.
Mm-hmm.
So once you guys get out of this meat locker and you get out into the world and you realize where you are, there's this great moment of realization of where you are, which is like right down the road from your house.
Yeah, it's actually by our house.
And I specifically set it there for a couple of other reasons that were just fun for our little kind of inside jokes of our and understanding of our neighborhoods in Santa Cruz County. I found the running of the game in basically like the right now, in 2024, very interesting, and quite frankly, a little bit liberating and a little bit of like hamstringing, because when you're describing a fantasy world, you can rely on the characters, I guess, and more so on the players, to make assumptions about your descriptions. If you say there's a tapestry, there's kind of an assumption that there's probably something woven in the tapestry, maybe some sort of crest or something like that. When you're running a game in the modern era, at least for me, my descriptions felt like they needed to be even more accurate, because the thing, you could literally drive your car and go look at the thing. And if I got it wrong, it would, and maybe this is me just being paranoid, you can tell me I'm wrong, but like it would undermine the credibility of the scene, especially if you're sitting there and you're like, there's not a staircase there, dude. That's a one-story building. I've seen that building before. I've been in that bar. Like, I don't know. There was this feeling of it was liberating because I have felt a little bit underprepared for fantasy role-playing just because I didn't read fantasy growing up, and it's just it's new to me, at least in the last 4 or 5 years. But then also, I don't know. I felt also hamstrung by the fact that there's a level of accuracy that needs to be there, describing things in our own backyard, literally sometimes, that can, if you don't accurately describe them, can break the verisimilitude and the suspension of disbelief. And now you can tell me that I'm worrying about this too much.
You're worrying about this too much. Thank you for the setup and getting me started, because I was like, oh, buddy, I'd want to be nice here, but wow.
Is this just like my own thing?
So
okay.
Dear listener, I'm going to ask you to give me some charity here, because I'm going to say something very bluntly. And I'm going to make a generalization, which
nobody cares. That's what he's going to say.
Matt and I try really hard on this show not to speak in one true wayism or generalizations, and try and move towards, let's have a thoughtful, specific conversation about whatever it is, or give a general thought framework. As a player, if your GM presents you anything and you start nitpicking the details, you're a bad player. Stop it. That's terrible. It's the equivalent of, now let me finish. I need to get this off my chest. Give me a minute. This is the equivalent of correcting somebody when they say you and me and you go, actually, you mean you and I. Point of fact, as a former English teacher, about half the time, no, you meant you and me. Look up the rule. Secondarily, it's just annoying. Don't do that to people. So had we done that, I would have been disappointed in us as players, not on you.
Okay.
I understand. Now I'm going to let off the gas.
Right. Like
now I'm going to let off the gas.
Okay.
Yes, if you had said...
Jody, my point.
Yeah, if you had said, and suddenly there is a blood rave in the giant gymnasium attached to the meat locker, okay, yes, because I know there's no gymnasium attached to that meat locker, I think. That, outside of something that's egregious, we're playing vampires, and this is one of those hollow, internet-y kind of arguments, but it's a parallel to the "that's not how magic would work" statement.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And we're playing vampires in a modern era in our real town. And if one of us went, yeah, but that's not how the town works. You're playing a vampire in Santa Cruz County in 2024.
Right.
Maybe it's different. And you did give yourself the out to say there are certain businesses that will exist because I liked them.
Okay. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to get back to this. I was hoping you'd mention this.
The long story short is no, you don't need to worry about it. And more importantly, as a point of DMD, hey, consider this. Just as a player, that would really rub me the wrong way, honestly. Is there was actually a point where you were like, it's here. And I was like, actually, I think that's another street over. I don't care. It doesn't matter. And it's not important that I know more about that's not my purview as a player. My purview is to have big feelings about my imaginary mom and my Ramones t-shirt, sweatshirt I was wearing, and this guy who just pulled up in an Escalade and said, "Get in, kid." And I went, well, I don't know. That's my purview, right? So that's my hot take answer. Listeners, thank you for not thinking ill of me for saying that really bluntly and vividly.
I want to talk more about the character development because that was the cool part. I think this is kind of the thing I want to spend some time on, and this is something that maybe we can use to inform Shadowdark, because there's a lot of conversations around old school fantasy RPGs about, there is no, you shouldn't come with a backstory. You should roll up these characters. They're expendable. But I think there might be something in the way that we developed characters here that could potentially, I don't know, it could potentially help develop characters in a Shadowdark game. And the thing I want to point out is there's this mechanic, or I guess there's this practice, I don't know if it's a mechanic really, where you lay out a piece of paper on the table during your vampire session. And the players...
was very cool. Sorry to interrupt. This was very cool.
The players write their character's name on the piece of paper and then draw lines connecting all three characters. And then periodically throughout the session, I had you define a positive thing that you had a connection with another character over. So, if one might write like, brave, or acts bravely under pressure because of something that happened previously in the session. And that felt novel in a way that also led me to believe that it could be... It was novel in a way that didn't feel like the novelty would wear off. It like, if you wanted to run a campaign, that's an interesting... It basically was creating a story web, and you'd add NPCs, you'd add a bunch of stuff, and it was like you were literally writing down your character's backstory, but it was all prompted by questions by the GM. And I wanted to get your take on this as a player. This felt like the most authentic backstory and character development that I've seen in a long time, and it was really fulfilling to watch the three of you as players answer questions, write things down. We had an instance of somebody writing something down and then crossing it out. I was like, that didn't happen. And we gave permission, like we created a permission structure for details of people's backstories to change. I don't know what this was. It clearly resonated with you, but I don't know. Is there something here that is maybe portable, or because I really like this. It was super cool, and it felt authentic in a way that other character development and backstory development doesn't necessarily. The closest thing I can give an example to is that D100 table that we talked about a while back, where you roll up a connection and then you have the players decide how the connection manifests. That also felt authentic, but this was like a completely different beast.
Yeah, there's so much stuff here. Holy cow.
one of the big things that I want to highlight about it that was deeply enjoyable for me as a player, and then I'll actually answer your question, was the fact that, and this is good old classroom teaching 101, or just maybe a little self-help 101, is focus on the positive. I loved that every time there was a prompt for a question, it was like, hey, that last scene was pretty intense. Or you just closed out your first night together. What is something positive you noticed about so-and-so? What is something you experienced about so-and-so? What did you like about so-and-so? Or at a later point, it was to spin off and get into the kind of, I believe you used the term solipsistic main character-ism kind of vibes. Hey, what person from your past life are you thinking about? You've had this quiet moment to reflect. Okay, now we're building an NPC tree. Again, building out the world outside of the real world map we were using, creating this fictional world, and then allowing players to grab their own parts of the map to bring in. In our area, Highway 17 is this kind of famous picturesque highway that's near us, and that featured heavily in my daughter's character's background, and it was really cool how that evolved and changed as we played. And that room to evolve and change and really get in there. The kind of asterisks I put on this whole thing is the problem that the character has to be persistent. You couldn't do this with a session 0, unfortunately. In the classic parlance of Shadowdark, and we've talked about in past episodes, some pros and cons of running session 0s. They're fun, but they're their own thing. A session 0 would kind of bury this. Additionally, it also would feel really lame if you went through all this work and then a stray goblin's arrow took out your character after they built this connection and reflection. So it does demand that, I don't know if demand is too strong a word, but it asks that these characters, there's an assumption, again, vampires are immortal, so they're going to stick around probably. There's an assumption that there's merit in building these connections, that these pasts that they lived and their future connections with this new brood of colleagues or whatever the term is, your party, is going to persist. And that's a lens shift, right? That is, to a degree, part of the fun of Shadowdark. Even to tragic effect recently, is death is always in the equation. So the question of how would you work it into a Shadowdark game is one of, are you willing to agree that these characters are kind of going to stick around?
Well, let me throw this back at you, because I thought about this, and you're right that it's much more authentic when the characters are going to stick around, and the things that you're writing on this piece of paper are blossoming from these three persistent characters. But one thing that I've seen in people talking about in terms of character death is, first of all, Shadowdark, and I agree with this sentiment, is that Shadowdark is not as lethal, especially once you get past level 1, than the internet would have you believe. Number 2, and this is the point that I think is even more interesting, is that I think a lot of people see PC death in any game as like the end of a story, right? It's the end of that character story. And that's because of the kinds of stories that we're familiar with, right? We're familiar with heroic narratives where there's a tragic death, and then, you know, maybe there's a Pyrrhic victory, or there's a victory, but at great cost or whatever. But the story is over very, very quickly. Whereas in a role-playing game, we have this like wonderful opportunity for the story to carry forward. And what I was thinking, and I want to try this, and I don't know when we're going to try this, but I would like to. The permanence of using, pen on a piece of paper means that character's name is always going to be on this sheet. And there will always have been connections to the presumably still living characters. And that means that this dead character, this dead PC in a Shadowdark game could potentially continue to have ramifications. So we talked about, in our Dolmenwood game, we've had several characters die. One of those character deaths, you don't know this, now you do, remains important. Mm-hmm. And well, not that you don't know that, but like I actively think about that character's death when prepping for sessions and when thinking about the world at large. Between every single session, it has informed many of the things that are going on in other parts of Dolmenwood that you don't know about. And once you check back in on them, or once I use a little vignette or whatever, it will create a dramatic beat. And I think I don't know. I want to try this. I don't know if this is the format that it should take, but I would love to see for those groups, and this is not for everybody, but for those groups who want more of that like narrative energy and narrative juice in their game, I think that this might be an answer, not the answer, but an answer for how do I make sure that a game that has mechanics that I like, but that is more lethal than maybe I'm looking for, how do I make sure that those characters still have some connection? And maybe making them persistent in a way that is literally physical on the table and persistent in the minds of the players because they're constantly looking at this web of PCs and NPCs and whatnot. I don't know. That seems like it could have potential. This is me thinking out loud, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
I absolutely think that's the case. And I want to be clear that I'm coupling a whole bunch of things together that I think you are speaking of as separate mechanical pieces, which is a better GM mindset, frankly, than what I'm doing. So I was saying a session 0 / level 1 PC in Shadowdark is engaging on their first set of adventures, and they are creating these connections because that was the stakes or pacing parallel to this vampire game.
Okay, gotcha.
In that very limited framework, I stand by what I said. Now, using what you're describing, I think that's a really fun idea. And I mean, most definitely can see where our Dolmenwood, for example, game where we've have multiple high-level characters and some new lower-level characters as a result of character death and et cetera, would absolutely work that way, where we would gain tremendous benefit if we had a big map of characters and the names of the fallen and all of that stuff and those connections we've had and pieces to draw from. And frankly, would just be happy with that for Dolmenwood so we could remember 1/10 of the amazingly ridiculous names that are part of Dolmenwood. Beyond that, I think if you're wanting to run a game, not only where the players between them have a little more codified narrative stakes to be together, and that's a classic problem of D&D going way back, is at some point the PCs go, why in the heck do we hang out together?
Right.
Why are we a group? And that's never answered. And we just met in a tavern and now we're off on adventure. This answers that very directly. These names and connections on paper, this shared progenitor experience of being, in this case, in the meat locker and then having our first feed together and our first night hold up during the day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those first experiences, we all shared those together. And yes, whether those characters lived or died, other characters would know, hey, we had that shared experience. That would be really valuable. Also, if you are running to run a game where there is going to be a generative narrative, which is, Matt, that's your juice. You like that sort of thing.
Indeed, I do.
Huge benefit here. It feels weird because it feels like spoiler, but I'm realizing it only mattered to those of us at the table. There's no spoiler because it came for us. Passively through this recording of names on the sheet and this building of NPCs and this slow exploration as we learned our characters and learned our mechanics and put dots into stats and skills, we all started spinning these stories. And weirdly, this thing of some sort of doctor or medical persons came into light, that we all had some sort of loose medical connection to our becoming our first awakened vampire selves. And are those all the same people? Are they different people? Are they connected? Do they know each other? Are they part of the same group? Are they different class? We don't know. But that exclusively came out of this process of spending a session learning the game, which was rad. Like, I really want to highlight that part. I want to come back right to that of learning the game as we went through it, but also that this generative narrative had very real stakes. Even though our 3 vampires characters were really different people and probably would align with very different clans.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
The 3 of them would not have bailed on each other, I don't think. Maybe one of them. My wife's character might have been like, y'all are beat, I'm out. But the others would have stuck together. And I don't think my character or my daughter's character would have been cool with her bailing on us. So there were, because of these bonds and because of these shared descriptions and because of knowing each other's backstories, that slowly emerged through the game. How did you feel, both at the time and in retrospect, about using that scenario to teach the game? Because this is this is, as far as I know, one part of Convention Play 101 is, hey, I'm running a Shadowdark game and I want to teach people Shadowdark. starting them blank slate and then slowly revealing the mechanics as we played. As somebody who, as I said at the top of the show, was intensely curious about this vampire game and likes game mechanics. I was like, how does it work? How does it work? How does it work? I want to know about these dots and D10s. I was clamoring and wanting more. I was giving me more mechanics, give me more mechanics. And really enjoyed that I got to see how the pieces fell together through play. I didn't just go, and this is when you roll at such and such, and you want to listen, the necessary how do we play this game. So as the GM and revealing the game to us, which was also a new game for you, how was that process? On one hand, I could see where it'd be really terrible of doing two things at once. But on the other hand, it also makes it very lived in.
So two things. First of all, I loved it, but I only loved it because the mechanics of Vampire the Masquerade are designed to tell the story of Vampire the Masquerade, right? So you have hunger dice that you roll inside of your dice pool, and certain results will cause different things to happen, right? So without getting too much into the kind of mechanicalness, it's important to note that a game like Vampire, the mechanics are narrative tools, whereas a game like Shadowdark, the mechanics of rolling a d20 and adding a number and trying to hit a target number does not evoke narrative, right? Like, what it evokes is a nostalgia for the games where you rolled a d20 and added a number, or rolled a d20 and tried to get below a number, or rolled a d20 at all.
Well, it's a binary, right? Like, for the most part, a d20 system operates on a binary premise of yes or no, whereas...
Right, and it's also nostalgia.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, a lot of Shadowdark is... I mean, a lot of the OSR is an attempt to, in a nostalgic way, harken back to a time that we all know full well didn't actually exist in the way that we're harkening back to, right? Like, this is all
know that,
right? I mean, like, this is the story of the elusive shift. This is the story of all of the wonderful work that, frankly, that John Pearson has done, kind of telling the story and history of Dungeons and Dragons, which I would love for him to focus on Vampire the Masquerade, frankly, because that intellectualization of the history of role-playing games, I think there's a lot of fruitful stuff there in the history of Vampire. But I digress. The thing about doing this in Shadowdark is that Shadowdark is roll a d20, try and roll high in many ways. And then if you roll high, sometimes you get to roll a different funky die. That's the beauty of the d20 fantasy game. I can teach my students how to play a d20 fantasy game, right? I can literally hand them a single die. I can tell them they're standing in front of this creek. The snow has just melted. It's early spring. The creek is rising just to the limits of its banks. You're in a forest. You need to get across this creek because you're trying to get to this temple that you know has long been forgotten and is filled with treasure. That's literally the premise of an innumerable number of introductory role-playing games I have run for a single student. Literally sometimes during like break or lunch after a class. And you can't do that in Vampire. I mean, you could. You just wouldn't be teaching the game. You can literally do that with Shadowdark. I know there's other noodly bits that we pile on, but ultimately the mechanics of Shadowdark do not serve the narrative. The mechanics of Vampire serve the narrative in a way that is bespoke. It is a game that is designed to tell a very particular kind of story. And while Shadowdark is designed to tell a particular kind of story as well, not in the same way that Vampire is. So I actually think that I would love to hear, and we'll certainly post a link to Treasure Hunt, but that seems like a framework that, first of all, I'm not familiar with, but it seems like a framework for like how to do what I did in this Vampire session in Shadowdark. And I would be very interested to read Treasure Hunt. I have not read it because I have not read all the old modules like you have, Jody. But
I have not read them all. It's different, but it's the different equivalent of 4D20.
How is it different from a gauntlet? I guess like this is, or like
Yeah.
just like rolling up a level 0 character.
So the difference is, and they add new mechanics is the problem. So agree with everything you said, and to achieve this with a D20 system, they add new mechanics is the long story short.
Gotcha.
So in Treasure Hunt, as you are going through things, there's a little checkbox for the GM of if the player does X, Y, or Z at this point, put a point here, put a point there, put a point there, put a point
interesting.
here. And then as they're playing, they will make these choices and do these things, and it will slowly reveal, hey, you're actually playing a thief. You're actually playing a fighter. You're playing a wizard.
Is that replicable for another event? Like, could you easily port that methodology into, the Scarlet Minotaur? Like, could you easily port?
I would say if you've read Treasure Hunt, for sure.
Okay.
For sure. It's very bespoke. So there's an idol to a long dead god here.
Yeah.
My character goes up and with reverence cleans off the covered idol. Point.
Sure.
Oh, there's sturges floating about. Oh, I go and seek cover in the shadows. Tick. I pick up a stick and I start swinging at them. Tick.
Okay, we can you can just kind of read what those are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you go, oh, your class is such and such. And then there's some MacGuffin-y cool things that happen when you spit out the other side. In Shadow Dark parlance, it would be, now that you've moved from level 0 to completing this adventure, you gain your class. Now make your talent rolls. Not unlike a gauntlet. So it would just be the concession is where a gauntlet is a meat grinder of chewing through characters. Again, we're not trying to chew through the characters. We would like them to survive and make good choices. Also, the nice thing about Treasure Hunt, if ported to Shadow Dark, it sets the tone of, hey, it's okay to run away from things because you wake up, you don't wake up naked on a deserted island, but it's worse actually than that. You don't have anything and you're on a desert island sort of, and bad things happen, and then it gets worse and worse and worse to a big exciting finale. It's a good stuff. It is actually one of my favorite of the old school modules, partly because of its novelty of answering this question of how do you create a meaningful backstory for characters. And this session did it. Like, success, gold star to both Matt as GM and this particular scenario, and the notion of using the paper and emphasizing the rules and letting the rules reveal themselves to the players through a slow progression of, you're going to have these dice because this has happened. And, it was really interesting. My wife, for whatever it's worth, said that she enjoyed it a great deal because her experience had been jumping in at the deep end. That,
right.
You have been a vampire for 50, 60, 100, 200 years, and you're experienced that life. And so the problem of that as a new player or a person who is like, I'm curious about this game, is, oh man, I need to learn all of these clans and what they do. And I need to understand the world of darkness before I ever play, which is a lame ask. Like, that's just
read these tomes.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
Reading a bunch of lore for a game you may or may not enjoy, and this bypassed all of that in a really enjoyable way that created a unique experience. All right, let's take a quick break from that, hear from our sponsor, and we'll come back and close her out.
Attention, adventurers, alchemists, and gardeners of the realm. Are you tired of withered wivenwort, drooping dragon fruit, or lackluster lettuce? Well, let the Rot Grub Compost Company turn your dead soil into a flourishing oasis of verdant delight. The Rot Grub Compost Company specializes in harnessing the natural enthusiasm of rot grubs to break down your scraps into rich, shall I say, magical compost that'll make even the crankiest druid jealous. These little critters don't just squirm, they work 24 hours a day, transforming yesterday's leftovers into tomorrow's bounty. So, if you're ready to turn your gardening around, let the Rot Grub Compost Company help you out. Because the only thing better than a garden of life is letting nature's little monsters do all their dirty work for you. So, Head to the Rot Grub Compost Company's website and start your fertilizer subscription today. Use the code DMD at checkout to get 10% off your first order. That is the Rot Grub Compost Company, where decay leads to delight.
Alrighty, let's gather around this fluorescent tube and see what we can take away from this
in
the background. That's right, with cool clothes and sunglasses at night. Matt, you took us to the table, so why don't you kick us off? What can you take away from this episode that might be useful?
You know what? I just want to throw out there for GMs, don't be afraid of a little backstory. One thing that I took away from this was and I'm going to use a word that I tend to try not to use, diegetic, which is this idea that use gameplay to define backstory. Don't be afraid to let characters and let players indulge themselves a little bit in their backstory and in who their character is. I know that characters die a lot in Shadowdark, but if I learned something from this session, it's that there's a way to do it that's healthy and that is fun for players.
You know, I'm going to take a kind of weird turn on this. We usually try and stay at the table. I'm going to give some homework here that I think is fascinating. If you enjoy our show, we think you'll probably enjoy this sort of thing. Go out there and do a little bit of reading. We alluded to it throughout the episode on White Wolf, the company that originally made the World of Darkness games and Vampire the Masquerade. Go learn about its heights of success and its precipitous fall thereafter and where it's currently at. It's an interesting story of the RPG industry. And for whatever it's worth, this isn't a spoiler. At one point, this was the #1 game. This is the only game that has ever, as far as we can tell, displaced D&D as the top RPG in the market for a very short window. It was Vampire the Masquerade. If you like your RPG history, this is a fascinating piece to go look at.
Well, Paizo would like to have a word with you, Jody, but
they got close. They got close. Heck of a job.
But long story short, I fully agree. My second and final takeaway is that questions, Jody. Ask your players questions. I have taken this away from this session more so than anything, and it goes with my first point about don't be afraid of a little backstory. Develop backstory via questions. Ask your characters not just what they do and how they interact with the world, but why. What are you doing and what is on your character's mind? Sly Flourish has a great resource for campfire stories and letting characters kind of develop themselves a little bit. And I know, again, I want to reiterate this. I know the characters die with a relative frequency that is much higher than in 5e or Vampire the Masquerade, but it is nice for players to feel a little bit of connection to their character. And there have been conversations on the Discord about my players don't seem to care about their characters, and they see them as expendable, and they don't want to play Shadowdark anymore, or something of that nature. And this might help with that.
Yeah, and it's not something you have to do right away. You can jump into the meat grinder and then when they're level 3 or 4, start asking these questions. It's never too late. Yeah, that's a fantastic one and something I want to kind of build back into my own bag of tricks. I'm going to go with the most obvious of obvious takeaways for this particular episode, being our first foray away from Shadowdark. Yeah, play other games. Go out there. There's so many awesome role-playing games out there. If you're unaware that they exist, go watch Quinn's Quest on YouTube. One more thing to put in the show notes. But yeah, when you go play other games, you can learn from them. Shadowdark is an amazing chassis for borrowing from other systems and bolting onto. There's so much freedom with Shadowdark to learn and develop and build upon ideas. It's all usable. It's all good stuff. And get out there and try something new. You'll be glad you did. All right, friends, as the sun sets, we hope you're able to find something useful in our discussion that you can take into a future game. If you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, head over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord channel. Look for links to any materials we referenced in this episode in that thread or in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadowdark Facebook page under the handle Hesman, and you can message Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, later, you vampire dog.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadowdark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.